Good morning. Hello, my name is Helen Christians, and I will be your MC this morning. I'd like to welcome you to the Sunday morning meeting of the Humanists of Greater Portland. The Humanists of Greater Portland is a chapter of the American Humanists Association. Humanism is not primarily about what one does not believe, but instead, humanism stands for the steadfast belief that is the responsibility of every person to lead an ethical life of personal fulfillment that aspires to the greater good. Humanists look to science, reason, and free inquiry to guide their actions and beliefs. The American Humanist Association has developed a list of 10 commitments, and these 10 commitments are gentle guides that put humanist beliefs into action. Our topic at today's meeting: neither theism nor scientism, toward a humanism of humility, or toward a postmodern religiosity, atheists welcome. It's quite a long title, but we're in for a wonderful presentation, I promise you. Today's topic will probably touch on all 10 of these humanist commitments, especially critical thinking and humility. Dave Pedworth is our reader this morning. Dave, are you there?
Yes, this book is The Founding Myths, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American by Andrew L. Seidel. He is the Strategic Response Coordinator for Freedom from Religion Foundation, and he is also a constitutional lawyer. And here's the reading. In America's wild marketplace, religion must be at least partly about marketing. It should come as no surprise that during the golden age of American marketing, the Madman era, religion was quite literally sold to the country. In his book, One Nation Under God, How Corporate America Invented Christian America, Princeton historian Kevin Kruse convincingly shows that the wave of public piety in America, which peaked in the 1950s, was a result of a coordinated corporate strategy. The campaign was launched during the 1930s and 40s in response to Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and the regulation it prompted. Businesses and industrialists, including DuPont, Firestone, U.S. Steel, and many more, sought to undermine the New Deal regulations they viewed as overly burdensome and to erode the power of the newly influential labor unions. The corporation's existing lobby groups, such as the National Association of Manufacturers and the American Liberty League, were too transparent. Most Americans understood that these groups were just extensions of the companies and dismissed them for what they were: a collection of tycoons looking out for their own self-interest. Undeterred, the corporations and industrialists turned to religious individuals, groups, and messages that were more sophisticated and less transparent. They began financing preachers who proclaimed messages such as every Christian should oppose the totalitarian trends of the New Deal. One of the more prominent corporate evangelists, James Fifield, sought to enlist 70,000 ministers in the revolt against Roosevelt. By arguing that the New Deal undermined Christianity, the clergy who joined the spiritual mobilization, as it was called, argued for a religious fervor. Their message could not be countered with logic because it was based on faith. They claimed that freedoms are given by their God, that Christianity and capitalism are inextricably intertwined, and the New Dealers were the ones violating the 10 Commandments, and most familiarly, that this is a nation under God. The high watermark of the religious messaging was the Religion in American Life campaign, conducted by the Ad Council as partnership with America's best admin and advertising agencies. RIAL, as it was called, professed two goals: to accent the importance of all religious institutions as the basis of American life, and two, to urge all Americans to attend the church or synagogue of their choice. The Ad Council ran 2,200 royal ads in newspapers in 1949 and steadily increased that number each year to nearly 10,000 ads in 1956. Magazine, radio, television, billboards, posters, and transportation hubs and ad cards all told Americans that free civilization rests upon a basis of religious faith. Truman even recorded a radio address for the campaign, and in it botched history with that the previous chapter of this book sought to straighten out. When the United States was established, its coins bore witness to the American faith. This is a quote of Truman. When the United States was established, its coins bore witness to the American faith in a benevolent deity. The motto then was, "In God we trust." That is still our motto, and we as a people still place our firm trust in God. The royal message, though inaccurate, was inescapable, according to Cruz. So that's the reading.
Wow. Thank you so much. Today's speaker is Dr. Jeff Seward, very popular to HGP and quite familiar, but I am going to read his bio because it's fascinating. He was born in Chicago and grew up in an Air Force family. He lived on or near military bases in Illinois, Alaska, California, Pennsylvania, North Dakota, and Texas, and also lived for 3 years in Germany. Along the way, he attended 2 elementary schools, 2 junior high schools, 2 high schools, and 6 universities. Those universities included Rice, UT Austin, MIT, Boise State, University of Washington, and finally Stanford, where he earned his Ph.D. in political science. He spent 3 years doing field work for his dissertation in Brazil, where he also met his Peruvian wife, Maria. The dissertation eventually turned into a book published by Routledge Press in 2016, The Politics of Capitalist Transformation, Brazilian Informatics Policy, Regime Change, and State Autonomy. During his 32 years, he finally ended up at a school for a long time. After his 32 years at Pacific University, or during his 32 years at Pacific University, Jeff taught over 40 different courses that have been cross-listed in a multitude of other departments. Prior to arriving at Pacific University in 1990, he taught for 3 years at the University of Texas in San Antonio, and before that, worked as a reporter and a prize-winning documentary film producer for public television stations in Boise and Seattle. Dr. Seward is an extremely popular HGP presenter who has talked to us usually post-election, but today is really quite different. He will be talking to us about our future in this very important presentation entitled "Neither Theism Nor Scientism: Toward a Humanism of Humility, or Toward a Postmodern Religiosity with Atheists Welcome." Welcome, Jeff. So glad you're here today. We're all excited to hear you.
Thanks for inviting me to speak to HGP again. I am retiring this year from Pacific University, and the other day I was thinking about my career and what its high points have been, and I realized that one of the most satisfying experiences I've had have been the series of lectures I've given to all of you. There have been something like 15 of them over the years. Today's talk, though, is going to be very different from my others. Previously, I've always talked about things from a viewpoint of expertise, about things I actually knew something about. I am a professional political scientist and a Ph.D. from Stanford, and I've always talked about political topics, often basically giving you an overview of one of my many political science courses at Pacific. Today, instead, I'm going to talk about science and religion, subjects about which I have no formal expertise at all. I have never had a course in philosophy or theology. I am completely unchurched, having probably attended less than 15 religious services in my entire life. As for science, I have never had even a high school biology class. Although I was named the outstanding physics student in my high school, I got a D in freshman physics at Rice University and a C in intro geology at the University of Texas. mostly because I rarely attended labs in either course. So in talking about religion and science, I come in all humility as nothing more than an interested, intelligent amateur who reads a lot about this stuff and thinks about it a lot. I only want to present a personal viewpoint, not to convince, but only to provoke thought. I hope at the end of my talk to have left you with some new questions, not to have converted you to a new perspective. The original title of this talk, as Helen just pointed out, was too long. I was asked to reduce it, but it started with neither theism nor scientism. And what I want to propose today is that some of the most important aspects of our natural reality are fundamentally mysterious. There are fundamental questions that we as humans will never be able to answer with either religion or science. For me, there are four of these mysteries. The first is about existence. Why is there anything at all instead of nothing? The second is about life. How did non-living matter become living matter? The third is about consciousness. How did living matter become self-conscious? And how does consciousness work anyway? The fourth is about free will. How can a universe governed by deterministic laws of physics, chemistry, and biology also contain the undeniable reality of the free will of conscious beings? Traditionally, such mysteries have been used to justify religious beliefs, with religions stepping forward to claim that they have absolutely true answers to these questions. There used to be a lot more mysteries and not much science, so this was pretty persuasive. Almost all of reality seemed mysterious, and the assumption of guiding divinities of various sorts seemed a plausible way to handle them. This was never really justified. Positing gods or a god or a flying spaghetti monster to resolve mysteries was essentially just putting a name on each mystery rather than explaining anything. Religious doctrines are essentially mythological literature and not reliable ways of actually knowing anything. I want to say later that the world's assorted religious mythologies nevertheless have great value, but that value does not lie in any ability to discover truth. Modern science has provided convincing answers to a vast array of old mysteries. When religious traditions tried to hang on to mythological answers that contradicted scientific discoveries, they just looked foolish and discredited themselves. Interestingly, this was recognized long ago by the early Catholic theologian Augustine, or Augustine, as some pronounce it. In the 5th century of the Common Era, Augustine did an analysis of the book of Genesis that rejected the notion that it could be read as historical truth. And he cautioned Christians against using the Bible or religious dogma to dispute conclusions about nature that others arrived at through observation and reason. As Augustine put it, usually even a non-Christian knows something about the earth, the heavens, and the other elements of this world, about the motion and orbit of the stars, and even their size and relative positions, about the predictable eclipses of the sun and moon, the cycles of the years and the seasons, about the kinds of animals, shrubs, stones, and so forth. And this knowledge he holds to as being certain from reason and experience. Now it is a disgraceful, this is Augustine still, now it is a disgraceful and dangerous thing for an infidel to hear a Christian, presumably giving the meaning of Holy Scripture, talking nonsense on these topics. For then to defend their utterly foolish and obviously untrue statements, they will try to call upon Holy Scripture for proof, and even recite from memory many passages which they think support their position, although they understand neither what they say nor the things about which they make assertion. Very interesting for the 5th century, right? Sadly, Later Catholic theologians failed to follow Augustine's advice, or they could have avoided all that ridiculous and nasty conflict with Copernicus, Galileo, and other early modern scientists. But the spectacular success of modern science in chipping away and sometimes simply demolishing religious answers to natural mysteries has led some to an arrogant overconfidence that I want to call scientism, which in some sense is as mythological in its central belief as the world's religions have been. Science doesn't claim to have definitive answers to the 4 mysteries I listed, more on that later, but scientism for me consists of the belief that human rationality operating through the scientific method will eventually or can potentially solve every mystery about the natural world. That there is nothing about reality that is outside the ability of the human mind to understand. In other words, scientism for me is the belief that in the long run, the human race is on the road to omniscience, that is, true knowledge about everything. We too often succumb to an idolatry of science, an idolatry that turns into scientism. I am convinced, on the contrary, that human access to reality is essentially limited by the limitations of our human organisms to observe and to think. A modern philosopher named Colin McGinn has been most influential in bringing me to this conclusion. This is his book titled The Mysterious Flame: Conscious Minds in a Material World. McGinn analyzes theories about consciousness and suggests that we will never understand consciousness, that something is going on there that is simply not accessible to our limited human minds. He claims it is terribly presumptuous of human beings to imagine that we have the capacity to understand everything. He offers the example of ants and other animals. This is McGinn now. Ants are remarkably intelligent at cooperating in joint ventures of foraging and nest building, but their algebra and French are not of a high standard. Dogs and cats have impressive olfactory intelligence, but they are less adept when it comes to table manners. We are innately equipped to speak, but no other animal has this faculty. The human mind consists of separate faculties, each dedicated to certain cognitive tasks: linguistic, social, practical, theoretical, abstract, spatial, and emotional. Evolution has equipped us with a large number of these modules, each with its own job to do. Thus, we have certain biases built into our mental architectures, certain things we are adapted for as against others. He goes on to say, but there are bound to be limitations that result from the initial function of the capacities in question. The ballet dancer can jump abnormally high, but not over 20 feet. Every mental faculty has limits to its achievements and acuity, and necessarily so. If it were not so, we would be supernatural beings like God, who suffers no such bounds or biases. That's the end of the McGinn quote. Because our mental capacities are so superior to ants or dogs or even whales and dolphins or chimpanzees, we easily jump to the assumption that our capacities are without limits or biases. The lesser animals have limits and biases, but not we superior human beings. But why would we be the only biological creatures with no such limits, no such biases? And remember, we humans have no direct access to reality. All of our perceptions of external reality are mediated by, are processed by our specific peculiar sense organs, and then interpreted again by our specific, peculiar brains with whatever limitations and biases they possess. And we're likely to be not very aware of the limitations and biases that our brains have as our brains look at our brains. So just as there are many things that ants or dogs or dolphins will never be able to understand, there must also be many aspects of reality that we can never get because of our biological limitations. So while our limited capacities make it possible to perceive some truths, it would be very strange if those limitations didn't at the same time make it impossible for us to perceive other truths. There must be some questions, some problems that we are constitutionally incapable of answering or solving. For that matter, some of the most prominent philosophers of science have always been against the idea that science produces uncontestable truths at all. Karl Popper, for example, maybe the most famous philosopher of science, is famous for his perspective that what distinguishes scientific theories is that they are potentially falsifiable. They are open to empirical facts that might contradict them. As Popper puts it, it is not his possession of knowledge of irrefutable truth that makes the man of science, but his persistent and reckless critical quest for truth. As another commentator sums up Popper, even immediate sense perception involves an interpretation. Consequently, our knowledge always begins with conjectures, assumptions, patterns, hypotheses, which must be exposed to scrutiny. So Popper himself concludes, I hold that hypotheses cannot be asserted to be true statements, but that they are provisional conjectures. The old scientific ideal of episteme, of absolute certain demonstrable language or knowledge, has proved to be an idol, Popper says. Every scientific statement must remain tentative forever. If this is the case for the physical sciences, it's even more true for the so-called social sciences. There's long been an effort to apply quantitative scientific methods to the social sciences. But in my view, that has yielded only limited and usually not very interesting results. One of the first things I did when I got a job at Pacific 32 years ago was to convince my one other colleague in our small department to delete science from our title, to shift from political science to politics and government. And for more interpretive, qualitative forms of social research, which is what I have always done, truth with a capital T has always been elusive. I love the way that the famous anthropologist Clifford Geertz has talked about this, reflecting on an analysis he had once done on a cross-cultural encounter. Geertz says, I do not know how long it would be profitable to meditate on the encounter of Cohen, the Sheik, and Dumari. But I do know that however long I did so, I would not get anywhere near to the bottom of it. Cultural analysis is intrinsically incomplete. It is a strange science whose most telling assertions are its most tremulously based, in which to get somewhere with the matter at hand is to intensify the suspicion that you are not quite getting it right. Interpretive anthropology is a science whose progress is marked less by a perfection of consensus than by a refinement of debate. What gets better is the precision with which we vex each other. I love that. So what does all this have to do with the four mysteries that I listed at the beginning? I think each of these is a mystery that science will never be able to solve. They are questions that are outside the ability of the scientific method to understand, and or possibly they are so because they are outside of human capacities to comprehend the mechanisms involved. They might be accessible to other organisms with different capacities than we have. but they may well be behind human capacities, not just for quite a while, but forever. Let's look at them one by one. Number one, the problem of existence. Why is there something instead of nothing? Why and how do we exist? How does anything exist? The religious answer is easy. God created something out of nothing. But of course, that's really no answer. That's just putting the word God in place of an answer. And besides, it raises the question, where the hell did God come from? But the same problem confronts the secular scientist. If matter has always existed, and the only problem is to understand how it developed over time, what caused that original matter? Where did it come from? Or are we forced to say that in the beginning, there existed something that had no cause? That is just as mystical and unsustainable as the concept of God. And it contradicts one of the principal tenets of science, that everything has a cause. Alternatively, if in the beginning there was nothing, how did it turn into something? Even if you imagine a moment where nothingness split into an equal amount of matter and antimatter, what generated the event? What force caused that split? And if there is such a cause, what caused that cause? If we accept the concept of the Big Bang, and I do, the whole cosmos, once upon a time, was compressed into an infinitesimally small point, which then exploded and has continued to expand ever since. But where did that original point of matter come from? And how could we ever possibly collect evidence using scientific method to investigate whatever existed prior to the Big Bang? So to me, the mystery of existence will be a mystery forever. It is not something science, or perhaps the human organism, is capable of investigating or comprehending. It remains a mystery. Number two, the mystery of life. How did non-living matter become living matter? Scientists have been working on this problem very diligently for the better part of a century, and they in many ways are no closer to a solution than when they began. The first obstacle to a scientific answer to the mystery of life is that there is no consensus about what life is. So there is no standard definition of what it is that is to be explained. One expert has identified 48 different definitions of life developed by scientists over the last 150 years. Professor Robert Hazen, a geologist who works on the problem of the origins of life, sums this up by commenting, "A more general definition that's able to distinguish all imaginable living objects from the diversity of non-living objects remains elusive." As a result, not all scientists are working from the same list. Are viruses alive? Some experts using some definitions say yes. Others using other definitions say no. A general working definition is that living objects are those that are capable of growth, reproduction, and evolution. But within that general concept, there's still much disagreement. There is also a deep divide between scientists who say there is some sort of more or less universal imperative leading to the emergence of life, and therefore life may be pretty common in the universe, just nowhere close. And those who say, no, it was a very complex, unique, full of chance sort of process that may have occurred only here on Earth. And so far, they don't have the sort of evidence that would allow them to resolve even that basic question. There's also nothing remotely resembling a consensus about the sort of mechanisms that could produce life. Biologists know a lot about the elements that are involved and how they have to come to interact, but what processes could have produced that complex set of interactions is anybody's guess. The various approaches that scientists are pursuing are wildly diverse. When I was young, I remember there was much excitement about something called the Miller-Urey experiments, where they created a soup of elements they thought were present in the early Earth and subjected them to simulated lightning and heat. They succeeded in producing a lot of biochemical compounds that are important components of life. Not all of the components by any means, but an interesting number of them. There are modern scientists still pursuing this sort of path, but it is plagued by devastating criticisms. Recent research, for example, doesn't support the same mix of elements in the early Earth's atmosphere or oceans as assumed by Miller and Urey. And the concentrations of them used in the experiments are also implausibly large to occur in nature. Perhaps most devastating, the intense radiation of the early Earth that the early Earth was exposed to would have completely broken down any of the biochemical compounds that Miller and Urey produced. So most other researchers have pursued other approaches. Some believe that early life must have emerged on the surfaces of rocks. Others that they must have emerged from super hot vents of undersea volcanoes. And some hypothesize that the first life arrived on meteors from other planets or even other solar systems. This wild diversity, and there are other approaches as well, this wild diversity demonstrates how little progress scientists are making toward any consensus on even basic concepts. And this last hypothesis about life on Earth coming from outer space only raises the question of how that life originated somewhere else. There's another problem, a sort of chicken and egg problem that I don't fully understand because I never took that high school biology class. Life on Earth, at least, requires two things: metabolism and genetic material like RNA and DNA. Without going into detail, which I don't really understand, each of these seems to require the other. But they are very independent aspects, and there's no obvious process by which they would emerge together. So scientists have done wonderful work on understanding what the emergence of life would require, but almost no consensus has developed about how in the world such requirements could actually happen. Moreover, they are not processes that have ever been observed directly. No scientist has ever observed non-living matter becoming living matter, and no scientist, of course, has ever been able to do this artificially in a lab. From the outside, this looks to me as if the more this mystery is explored and understood, the more mysterious the process by which it could have happened becomes. My suspicion is that this is one of those realities that the human organism or the scientific method is not well equipped to understand. Number 3, consciousness. How did living matter become self-conscious? And how does consciousness work? What the hell is consciousness anyway? This is the mystery that is the subject of Colin McGinn's book, which I highly recommend. Wonderfully written, The Mysterious Flame, Conscious Minds in a Material World. He makes a convincing argument that we just aren't equipped to understand what is going on with consciousness. What is it? We can't observe any consciousness directly except our own. We can create computer simulations that can fool human beings into believing they are interacting with human consciousness, the so-called Turing test. We know those computers are not conscious, but how do we know that what we believe is consciousness in others isn't some similar simulation that is fooling us? How can I even go about proving to you that I am a conscious being? Perhaps even a larger problem is that all the explanations for the relationship between our physical bodies, especially our brains, and consciousness are deeply flawed and self-contradictory. Philosophers have punched deep holes in all of the various approaches. We know the two are connected. We can change our consciousness by flooding our brains with alcohol or drugs. We can change our consciousness through injury or trauma to the brain. We know that we can change our body through acts of consciousness. I can will myself to speak, and I speak. I can decide to raise my arm or do the hokey pokey, and my body will do that. How is that possible? How can an immaterial idea in my mind move the matter of my body? This is really a very deep mystery. There are several approaches. The materialists suggest that consciousness is nothing other than the various elements of the brain, neurons firing, etc. But we can have complete knowledge of the functioning of your brain and still have no sense of what you are consciously experiencing. One philosopher put this famously with the question, what is it like to be a bat? The bat's brain is much like ours, and we can investigate how it functions until the cows come home, but that will never give us an awareness of what the experience of being a bat is like. Our consciousness is unquestionably caused by the functioning of our brain, but why the functioning of the brain generates consciousness, but the complex functioning of other organs does not, is a question that completely eludes us. Consciousness cannot be reduced to the functioning of the brain, even though it is obviously dependent upon it. A second approach, much closer to our common sense, is dualism. That there's no logical relation between the brain and our minds because they are separate realms. As McGinn describes this notion, mind and brain run in parallel, like skis, but we cannot collapse the one into the other. They are distinct existences. However, this ultimately boils down to the idea that consciousness doesn't really matter, that it is just a kind of epiphenomenon that does not cause our behavior. It is just something independent but inconsequential that happens while our brains direct our actions. But this would suggest that our bodies could function just the same without consciousness, or that consciousness could exist like a ghost, independent of our bodies. But that makes no sense. As McGinn says, the problem with materialism is it tries to construct the mind out of properties that refuse to add up to mentality. The trouble with dualism is that it cuts the mind off too radically from the brain. McGinn's solution, my thesis, he says, is that consciousness depends upon an unknowable natural property of the brain. In other words, there is a kind of property that our human biology, although it can produce it, is not properly equipped to perceive, investigate, or understand. It is thus a permanent mystery, according to McGinn, whose solution will always elude our limited human cognitive abilities. That brings us to the closely related problem of free will. How can a universe governed by deterministic laws of physics, chemistry, and biology also contain an undeniable reality of the free will of conscious beings? The deterministic perspective is an attractive one. It conforms to our scientific understanding that everything has a cause. Long ago, I took a course in educational psychology at Boise State University from a wonderful Professor McDonald. The only thing I remember from the course was his constant mantra, behavior is caused. He said it at least once every class period. Behavior is caused. The idea was that we should always seek out the cause of bizarre or disruptive behavior instead of just blaming students for being bad. That makes sense. But if we embrace that completely, then everything I do at this moment, like pick up that glass, if I had perfect knowledge could be traced in a perfect causal chain all the way back to the Big Bang. It was already determined in that moment that I was about to sing in German. Ich weiß nicht, was soll es bedeuten, dass ich so traurig bin. I had no role myself in choosing to just do that, or in following it with a bit of Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toads did gyre and gimble in the wave. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome wraths outgrave. It has been determined for millions of years that I will now raise my arm over my head, and now I will lay it down again. Every line, every word in every Shakespeare play was predetermined at the beginning of time. The absurdity of this is profound, and it completely violates our experience of everyday behavior and reality. Another aspect of its absurdity is the implication of determinism for how we should act. How should we deal with criminals, for example, if their criminal acts are not a choice at all, but completely determined since before they were born? If so, they bear no responsibility for their acts. But thinking about it a little bit more, what sense does it even make to ask a question like, how should we behave? We have no choice in the matter. The very word should can be stricken from our vocabulary because it implies that we face choices. Unfortunately, the rejection of determinism also seems to lead to absurdities. It seems like common sense that our choices are highly conditioned by external influences of all kind, but we still exercise free choice within those external constraints. This is one approach to the debate social scientists have long had over the relative importance of structure, that is external constraints, and agency, that is choice within the boundaries of those constraints. A central theme of my book about Brazilian policymaking is that while recognizing the importance of external structural constraints, I insist that policymakers made a series of real choices that were not strictly dictated by those constraints. So the final paragraph of my book is the following. The old cliche, politics is the art of the possible, is normally taken to suggest the limitations of politics as a warning to those with utopian political agendas. This familiar maxim that politics is the art of the possible, however, should also be taken to suggest the limits of political analysis as a warning against the tendency to reduce political processes to rigid structural or functional determinants. Political processes also always involved an important element of irreducible indeterminacy, options, alternatives, multiple possibilities. Ultimately, political analysis too must resign itself to being an art of the possible rather than a science of the inevitable. But just look at what this emphasis on free choice implies. After we take into account all the external influences, at the heart of our decisions, every decision is a little piece of consciousness that is utterly uninfluenced and free to choose A or B. When it chooses, it engages in an act that, according to this viewpoint, has no cause outside of itself. How is that possible? How can anything exist without a prior cause? We're back to the same problem we had thinking about God as existing prior to existence, or some original something that had no prior cause. Things without causes not only violate a fundamental principle of science, they violate one of our most profoundly felt experiences of the world. So both determinacy and indeterminacy seem impossible, and yet it is a profound part of our daily experience that the two do exist, even though they completely contradict each other. What is the solution to this mystery, this paradox? I don't know, but philosophers have been trying unsuccessfully to solve it for thousands of years. And it seems to me one of those things that is probably outside the capacity of human brains to comprehend. So, if these mysteries are impossible for human rationality to solve or understand, why not turn to an alternative way of knowing, an alternative way of discovering the truth? Religion. The problem with that is a simple one that I don't have to explain to this group. Religious solutions to these mysteries have no basis at all. They are simply dogmatic assertions that don't explain anything. They just slap down God or the flying spaghetti monster on the table and walk away, asking you to believe by faith that the mystery has been transcended. One early church father, Tertullian, even said this out loud: "We believe because it is absurd." That is, there's no way to come to the Christian solutions through rational thought, and therefore faith is necessary to understand it and accept it. Unlike science, religion simply is not a truth-seeking enterprise. Religious ideas are rather literature, the imaginative creation of mythological narratives that give us a variety of ways to psychologically paper over fundamental mysteries. I would argue there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that. There's even something rather majestic about it. I like literature. I like mythological narratives, as long as we remember that that is what they are and don't start treating them as absolute truths handed down by divinities. That every religious tradition has come up with very different mythological narratives shows clearly that that's what they are. As long ago as Rousseau, he surveyed all that and said, these are obviously ideas manufactured by men, and none of their claims to truth are any better than any other. To elevate mythological narratives to the status of absolute truths is in fact a form of idolatry. And that's one of the 10 commandments that the Bible condemns, right? I like to look at them as literary devices available to people who prefer a story instead of simply a blank mystery. Things that we would like to think are true without actually believing them to be true. For myself, for example, my father fell sick suddenly one day in Boise, had unsuccessful surgery, and died soon after, long ago now. This happened on the day that my wife, Maria, was going through the ceremony to become a US citizen. So I waited until her ceremony was over, got in my car, and drove to Boise. But by the time I arrived, my father was already dead. It was a gray day when I was driving, but as I was driving to Boise, about the time my father passed away, the clouds opened up for a moment and there was a burst of sunlight. It felt to me very strongly that this was my father saying goodbye. And to this day, that's the way I like to think of it. I don't believe that that's what actually happened, but it comforts me in some sense. And so I like to think of it that way. Similarly, I like to think that Buddhist notions of consciousness and death are true. That at the core of reality is a single cosmic consciousness, that our individuated consciousnesses are a kind of illusion, and death represents the end of that illusion and the resubmergence of my individuated consciousness into the one cosmic consciousness. That is a comforting idea to me for some reason. I don't believe that story, but I like to think it is true. I also think that embedded in every great set of religious ideas is a huge store of valuable insights into ethics, morality, the shape of the good life, etc. Religious claims to arrive at truth need to be resisted at every moment. Those claims have over and over led to bigotry, intolerance, divine justification for tyrannical authority, etc. But I like the approach of Houston Smith, whose books, World Religions, I strongly recommend to you. It's also full of beautiful photos of religious art from various traditions. In his book, he surveys all the great religions of the world, which he calls wisdom traditions. His sympathetic account of their main beliefs and ethical principles would lead the reader to imagine that he is actually a believer in turn of each religion that he summarizes. In his conclusion, he says something I think I fundamentally agree with. This is what Houston Smith says. Modern science has retired their cosmologies, and the social mores of their day, which they reflect, must be reassessed in the light of changing times and the continuing struggle for justice. But if we single out their conclusions about reality and how life should be lived, they begin to look like the winnowed wisdom of the human race. And we encounter the human virtues, which are basically three: humility, charity, and veracity. Which leads me to my suggested religion of humility, which has the following tenets that, as Helen says, may be very close to the tenets of humanism that many of you subscribe to. Number one, for all of our human capacities for discovering the secrets of the universe, reality remains in many important respects full of unsolved and unsolvable mysteries. Two, science cannot solve all these mysteries, and religion has only literary mythological narratives to offer. Three, it behooves us then to be humble in the face of the mysteries of reality and open-minded about the wide variety of approaches, including religious ones, for telling ourselves stories to cope with those mysteries. Four, this implies being humble about our own capacity to uncover truth and tolerance for traditions and perspectives other than our own, all of which may have valuable things to say to us about how to live in the face of these mysteries. And finally, five, but this also implies intolerance of and fierce resistance to any philosophy or movement that claims to have final answers or absolute truths about anything. That includes complete rejection of all religious claims to truth, but it also includes rejection of an exaggerated account of the capacities of human rationality, rejection of the idolatry of science that is scientism. And I would like to close with something that may or may not be directly related from the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, who I quoted earlier. It relates to a favorite mythological narrative of mine, which seems somehow akin to our perplexities about the ultimate origins of the universe. Here's Clifford Geertz's account. There is an Indian story about an Englishman who, having been told that the world rested on a platform, which rested on the back of an elephant, which rested in turn on the back of a turtle, asked, "What did the turtle rest on?" "Another turtle," he was told. "And that turtle?" "Ah, Sahib, after that, it is turtles all the way down." Thank you. Any questions?
Jeff, there's questions galore here. As you were talking, they all appeared on the chat. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I know, okay, so let's start, Jeff, here. Kathy Moyd, why does nature have to have a hard line between life and non-life just because we've developed a word life with a hard line?
I think that's a good question. And some of the things I've read say, this is really a semantic issue.
Yeah.
But we do know that there's a difference between our living organisms and inanimate objects around us, the table. There's clearly something fundamentally different there. Yeah. That the line can't be easily drawn suggests that it's awfully difficult to study. If you don't know on which side of this line life begins, how do you decide what leads to it? And yet, the distinction between living stuff and non-living stuff isn't simply semantic. I mean, there's a real difference between me and my table. I think it's sort of part of the mystery that we can't even define what it is we're talking about or identify the line on one side of which is life and on the other side of which is non-life. So I mean, that I agree with the comment, but it seems to me that simply enhances the idea that this is a deep mystery that we're unlikely to unravel.
Can I?
Sure, Kathy, come on in.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree that there is a large group of, almost everything you can say life or not life, but that there's an acceptable gray area in the middle where things may have some characteristics we associate with life and other characteristics we don't. And that just because we have made up a word that says life doesn't mean that we have to exactly find in nature where that line is.
It's part of the mystery. Thank
So
you.
I do agree that it's a semantic problem that's not unsolvable, because in most cases we can make a decision.
Thank you, Kathy. Dave DiNucci has a comment. If viruses are considered alive, metabolism isn't required, apparently. And it's just a continuation.
Yeah, that was just a reaction to a comment that he made.
Dave,
I don't have an answer for that because I never took a high school biology class. I don't really understand metabolism or viruses. I just know that in my reading, people have suggested that life needs metabolism and genetic materials, and that there's no obvious reason for them to happen together. They're sort of independent and yet necessary to create a living being. But yeah, I expect that what you just said is one reason some scientists say viruses are alive and other scientists say, no, they're not.
Yeah.
Because they're working from different definitions of what life is.
Right.
And right now they're winning. Viruses are winning.
Yes, whatever they are, they're winning.
They're winning. Dave Gray, can you come in? You wanted to make you had a question, you wanted to make a comment. Come on in, Dave Gray.
I'm a fan of science. I subscribe to 4 science magazines. I do not get the impression from all the stuff I read by scientists or by scientific journalists that the standard belief is that, oh, science has all the answers or will have all the answers. My impression is that the practitioners of science think there's always some uncertainty. And I certainly believe that. There's always some uncertainty, no matter how far science will get in examining any issue. And just one little comment about the mind versus brain. I come up with this idea that our brains have operating systems like the Windows operating system or the Apple operating system, and we take in huge amounts of data, and our operating system determines what our response to that data is. Well, interesting idea, but every individual's operating system is somewhat different. So we have billions of operating systems. Are we ever going to completely figure out our brain's operating system? I don't think so. But anyway, just to conclude, scientism as an absolute sort of fundamentalist belief system, I don't think that's so common. Scientists accept uncertainty.
Thanks, Dave.
I think that's true. I don't suggest that all scientists are guilty of scientism. But I think it's out there that, and it's out there kind of as a defense against religion, to say, well, religion has repeatedly proven itself ridiculous because it keeps making claims about reality, and then science comes up with the answer. And so it retreats to other mysteries that aren't yet solved. But we're going to get to those too. And so there's no refuge for religion there. I think that's the wrong way to combat religion. The problem with religion is that it's not a truth-seeking enterprise.
Right.
It's literature.
Right.
And so you don't have to claim that someday we're going to explain everything to reject religious ideology. But that's where some folks are.
Good point. Let's see. Vale Humble has a comment. The usual discussion of free will assumes dualism. If you reject dualism, the only meaning of free will is who should suffer the consequence of actions. Why not the actor?
Not sure I completely understand the last part of that question, but it may well be that free will presumes dualism, but as I mentioned, philosophers think dualism sucks. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
But neither does non-dualism. And so free will, I think, is caught in that same problem between the impossibility of dualism and the impossibility of monism. And going back to the idea about the operating systems in the brain, there are some philosophers and scientists of consciousness in the brain who think they've solved it, who say the brain is nothing but a digital computer that happens to work through biological neurons and synapses and so forth, and that's all that it is. And so they also are the ones who believe that with artificial intelligence, we're eventually going to create machines that have consciousness. I think the arguments of those who dispute that are very convincing. I think that's nonsense. And I don't think that I think artificial intelligence is going to create machines that program themselves, that learn, that behave unpredictably, maybe even dangerously, but not consciously. You know, unpredictability is not the same thing as consciousness.
Thank you. Polly just had a comment. The Bible's a fine book as long as we remember it's fiction. Joyce, you want to come in and you have a question? Joyce Lackey.
Okay.
Yeah, come on in.
Yeah, this is all so fascinating, and I'm wondering where art falls into all of this. Sure, it's a human construct and it comes out of consciousness, but is it an attempt to understand the others of us in the human society? And what did I? Oh wait, that's not what I marked. It seems to me like, you know, a person who writes a novel is trying to understand that person out there that you said, I have no way to know that you are conscious. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So, but I must believe that I can figure that out, even if I base it on my own consciousness. And so art somehow, I think, is maybe trying to fill that void. And that made me think of, and this is a line I've quoted many times, I think, in this group, but Robert Frost makes the comment in Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, that freedom, I think it's in that one, anyway, freedom is moving easily within the harness. So that comes back to your free will idea of, sure, there are limitations, but I choose so much. You know, there are just so many things. That came out of the think about.
Yeah, there is movement inside the harness. As for art, I mean, I think of art as an attempt to transcend language, to communicate profoundly without the use of the clunky mechanical device of language. It's also language itself. I used to say this to my students teaching writing. I said, you know, writing is tough because you're doing something that's almost magical, language itself. If you just imagine what we're doing, I have an idea in my head of something. I'm translating it into abstract symbols, noises that I speak. You receive them with your imperfect auditory faculties. interpret them into your brain, translate them back into an idea that somehow resembles what it was I was originally trying to transmit from my consciousness to your consciousness. What a miracle that that happens at all, that you know, that's like the worst possible game of telephone, right? How do we manage to transmit anything accurately through such a ridiculous process? And so when you're writing or speaking, you have to remember how difficult and magical this process is and try and craft your language so that it jumps across that divide, losing as little of the signal as possible. And art is even more magical because it tries to communicate somehow even more directly to our psyche, requiring less translation somehow, that music or a picture or a poem can somehow enter directly into our consciousness with less mediation.
So is it a mirage that we're actually communicating?
Doesn't seem to be, because we manage to get things done through communicating to each other, and it works to shape cooperation in very complex and precise ways. At the same time, there's a tremendous amount of misunderstanding that goes on as a result of, it would be so much more efficient if we were really telepathic.
I don't want to hold the floor too long, but that made me think of science, and that's what science does. We get results.
Yeah, that are tentative.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I mean, the bridges we build, the cities we build, the sensors we send into space, the physical things we've created, they're
Fall down.
deteriorate over time, but they're there.
I mean, technology is wonderful, but it's always an approximation too.
Sure.
So we constantly have structure, you know, the Titanic sinks, and that wonderful warping bridge over the Hood Canal, you know, happens despite the best efforts of engineers. Buildings fall down. So, you know, the best engineers are doing the best they can within the knowledge that they have. But I would guess that most engineers and architects would say nothing they've ever built was perfectly right.
I want to tie that into religion too, but I've talked enough. Talk to you later.
Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, Jeff. I want to let folks know in the chat that Jeff has written in the 2 books that he talked about, The Mysterious Flame by McGinn, and the Illustrated World Religions, Guide to Your Wisdom of Tradition. So you'll be able to get information about those books. Pete Marquette has a comment on the topic of the subjective difficulty of studying our own brains. Will artificial intelligence possibly give us more objective look at ourselves in the future?
I think it will give us better working on that will give us a better understanding of how the computer-like aspects of our brain work. I think this has already happened. I think when people first started working on artificial intelligence, they thought it would be much easier than it turned out to be. They thought, for example, creating language simulators or translators would be a simple matter. You know, you got the words here and you put them in there, and then turns out language is tremendously more complex and subtle than that. And you see artificial intelligence making the weirdest mistakes. Did you read this story about Alexa the other day? A little girl, 10 years old, was entertaining herself with various challenges, right? And she was asking Alexa for challenge, and she'd run out of challenges. So she said to Alexa, "Could you give me another challenge?" So Alexa went out searching the internet, went to TikTok and found a challenge, and told the little girl to do the following. Take the charger from your telephone or from your phone, plug it into a socket halfway so that the prongs are exposed, and then take a penny and touch the exposed prongs with the penny.
No.
This was a challenge that she had found on TikTok, that
Wow.
Alexa had found on
Oh
TikTok.
my God.
Wow.
And there was nothing in her programming
To stop.
that told her that's a dumb and dangerous thing to be doing. The little girl, however, was smart enough to know that this was a dumb thing to do, and she didn't do it. She went and told her mother that that's what Alexa had told her to do.
Wow.
She reported it to whoever who does it. It's Apple that does Alexa, isn't it?
Yeah.
And they claim to have fixed that.
But there's the next one's coming. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
the next one's coming.
Yeah. As a electrocution is nothing to play with. That's terrible. It's terrible.
Please.
But so we're learning a lot. You know, we've learned a lot about language by trying to get machines to replicate it.
Mhm.
And they do a pretty damn good job now. But they still then occasionally make the most ridiculous and absurd errors
Mhm.
because they don't know what they're doing.
It's
They aren't conscious of what they're doing. And so they stumble into mistakes that a conscious being would never do.
Excellent. First off, I want to acknowledge the Humanist Society for providing this platform for somebody with your intellect and your insights and your use of beautiful language. I'm Ph.D. in immunology. I'm a scientist in the generic sense of the word. Yes. And what stuck out with me with all of this wonderful discussion is you're driving to Boise. Your father is either dying or dead. And it's a gray day, and then the skies open up and there's sunlight up there. And you said, oh, it's my father saying goodbye to me. And you said, I know it's not true. I mean, I'm a rational person, but I'd like to think that maybe that was a possibility. Go back 40 years ago when Renee and I belonged to Ethical Culture, which was on the East Coast, the prelude or the left arm of Humanist Society, same thinking. It's not what you believe in, it's what you do. The credo that we followed. Comes Easter, comes Passover, our leader said, you know, we're feeling left out. So we create Spring Festival. Comes Christmas, comes Hanukkah, we create Fall Festival. It's a clear reminder, as we've seen in the last 2 years, that we crave fellowship.
Yes.
The human animal needs the interaction of other people, even of a different opinion, as long as we're decent to each other. So there is that mystery. I'm a vegetarian. I eat twice a day, but I acknowledge the gifts of that food. And I put nature on a pedestal because when I took a biology course, not in high school, I'll end it with this because it just boggles my mind. I have Douglas firs out the back door here. They're 90 to 100 feet high. The very top of that tree is nourished. The water that comes in from the roots by the concept of water, the cohesion of water molecules, and the fact that we only think of plants as doing, the photosynthesis, but they do transpiration. You know, the idea of taking plants out of the hospital bedroom because it's using the oxygen that the patient needs, pulls that water up 90 feet to the top of that tree and feeds and nourishes the leaves and whatever is up there.
Mhm.
There's a mystery. There's a mystery, and in a way, I want it to stay that way. I don't want everything explained.
By the way, the reason I never took a high school biology class, I did take chemistry and physics. In Fargo, North Dakota, where I was, they were introducing a new experimental kind of biology course, and they required everybody after the 9th grade who was going to take biology to make an insect collection during the summer. So all my friends were busy catching butterflies and things and pinning them to boards to present their insect collection. And that repelled me. I didn't want to do that. It wasn't respect for life exactly. It was just, that felt icky. So I skipped high school biology because I didn't want to make a bug collection.
Well, you reminded me of basic biology at Brooklyn College. The first time we had to pith a frog and stick a device into the back of the frog's neck and destroy its life, and then cut it open and learn the structure of the internal. I said, why are we doing this? And yet I went ahead and did a doctorate on urticaria, a disease of the skin. I had 6 different guinea pigs. I took skin biopsies from them for 6 months. They each had individual personas. They knew when I was coming. Some overreacted. Others were submitted to my doings. When I finally had to put them down, it took me a couple of days to process, especially the one that was afraid of me and reacted knowing full well what was going to happen. So what I'm meandering about is that I just don't know if our inner sensitivities are bad. They're there for a reason, in a sense. I reach out to my dogs. I reach out to my wife of 65 years. I worry about the next generation and what they're going to contend with in terms of the climate change. Anyway, I thank you profusely. Your books, the one by Nick Higgins.
Your atheist wife.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and my atheist wife brought up Orthodox Sephardic Jew in Brooklyn, New York, fasted on Yom Kippur, you know, and did everything. Even in the army, I went to services and whatever, but gradually pulled away from it. But you know what? I miss the singing in the temple. I miss eating. But after I looked at it, I realized it was a men's club. The women were, because it was Orthodox, were upstairs separated. And when my father died, this did it for me. My mother couldn't go to the burial. Why? Because in the Orthodox tradition, a woman may be unclean and she can't be at the burial site. And that sort of ended it. I said, you know, it's the short-sightedness of the fear of men who in their own self-aggrandizement are really afraid of women, because the biology of the next generation is not the guy. He drops his deposit. It's the female that brings life on and continues it going on.
Your comment about drifting away from the Orthodox upbringing reminds me of a book. Do any of you know a book called Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit?
No.
No.
It's a wonderful novel. I highly recommend it. It's kind of autobiographical, but not, it's a fictionalized autobiography of a woman who grew up in a sort of an oddball fundamentalist Christian sect in a small town in northern England. And she wants to be a missionary. She's full of religious fervor and she wants to be a missionary. But as she matures, she also comes to realize that she's a lesbian. And the church eventually discovers this and ostracizes it. Her mother rejects her, and she loses all of this faith that was such a strong thing in the beginning. And it's a story of this journey. It's a wonderful book. But at one point, then she's reflecting on this, and she starts a long reflection by saying, I miss God, because she no longer has that belief, and it completely oriented her life. And there were so many aspects of the community within which that belief was nested. And so she doesn't miss God enough to re-believe in him, but she misses that, the warmth and the sustenance of that tradition somehow. But it's a chilling line when I came to it. You know, I miss God.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And the world, I think, in some sense, the world misses God and has been trying to find some reasonable substitute for what the concept of God did for us in some other vein, because that concept is no longer viable for us.
Yes. Again, thank you very much. Helen?
Welcome.
Yep.
My pleasure.
Okay. Jeff, we're out of time, and I'm going to have to close the meeting, but we do have afterthoughts. Will you be
I'm happy to stay here as long as people have questions.
I know people would love to have you join afterthoughts. I'm gonna let us, if everybody, come on camera, we'll just give you a silent round of applause. But it was absolutely wonderful. We just so appreciated everything that you do.